Hello, this is the next material. I wanted to show you today how I paint gold non-metallic metal. Also, I will show you how I paint textures on gold. For gold non-metallic metal, there are very many different colors that you can use. Most of the time I use colors like those, but those are very warm. So the mid-tones are very warm, and for non-metallic gold especially, it's very important to have colors that are very similar to those. We can of course use different colors, but some are warmer, some have more orange, some are more desaturated, and it will give you a different feeling of the gold. So as you can see on my ring, the gold is very yellow. Yeah, it's not that orange. So if you want to make a fantasy version of the gold non-metallic metal, it's good to use warm colors. For the shadows, we also can use very deep reddish browns like this one, or something maybe gray, even a little green. But here you can see that I used very warm colors. So for this particular non-metallic metal that I will show you, I will use warm colors. This one is with mixtures of red and brown, and this one is more brown, and here you can see even more orange. Very important for me is also the highlight, because it should have more yellow, even desaturated sand yellow, but something like those two. And we also don't use white for non-metallic gold, because we want to have a difference between silver and steel that will have additions of white in the final highlights, and gold has its own color. It's mostly yellow, yeah, and the highlights won't be that white. So for this one I use the white sands paint. That's almost white, but it's with additions of small additions of yellow. So those are the colors. Now we will prepare the wet palette using those colors, as I do every time. It's very important to mention it that you can see I use some paints from the Scale Color standard line and some from the Fantasy Games line, and they have differences. So even if you use paints from Games Workshop or Vallejo, they have different properties. So the paints from Scale are very thick and they need more dilution, and those standard ones, and those don't need that much because they are thinner. So I will dilute those more and those a little less. So I want to have the covering property that is good for blends. So let's prepare those paints. So you can see this one is dark, but a little with additions of red. And also on our blue marine, it's very good to use warm colors of the non-metallic metal, because it will generate a big difference. So the blue armor is cold, but all the things that we will paint with warm colors will be very visible by contrast on the whole miniature. Here you can see there's not a big difference between those two colors, but you can use it also. So you can see that for non-metallic metals and surfaces that need a lot of contrast, I use a little more more colors, so you can see the transition is bigger. Usually I want to have maybe 9 dots of the paint, but here I used more. Okay, this will be for the final highlight. It's a little of this one. Okay. So you can see that we have a big range of contrast between this very dark paint and this very bright paint.
The next morning.
So today I wanted to show you how I paint non-metallic gold on the chest piece of our Space Marine and also on his belt. These are small pieces, so it will be very good to show them. Also we have the chest piece finished and we have the lined plant, so we can do this in the similar way as we've done earlier. So first let's cover the whole surface with the darkest color of the gold. And for this I used Arbuckle brown. It's a color that is reddish with additions of brown. So on a dark background it looks dark, but it gives a very warm feeling. But if we would paint with it on a very bright background, it would be very reddish. We can, as I mentioned earlier, we can also use for the deepest shadows, we can use colors that are with additions of blue, with additions of it will give a different feeling on the whole miniature. But here it's very good to do it with warm colors because it gives a big contrast to all the cold armor, and it will be very visible. Okay, so this is the base tone. So now let's start sketching. Okay, so you see that the eagle here will have strong light, because here we have a line of highlight and also here. So in those places the skull and the wings will catch more light. So we can sketch it. Also the belt is a little tilted to the bottom, so the part that will catch more light is here, the upper part. So here and here. But if we interpret it in such a way, then there will be more light reflected from the surrounding or from the bottom. So we will try to keep this place dark, also here, but the bottom will be brighter, but not as bright as the main reflection here, also here. Because it's only the light that is reflected from objects that are around, and it's a little dispersed, it won't be that strong. So you can see that the game color paint has smaller covering properties. The standard scale color paints have a stronger cover well. Those need a little more layering. And also here we will have a next highlight. Okay, so this is the one. So next, let's jump to a higher tone. Also, all the edges will catch more light, so I'm edge highlighting them. And the bottom. Remember, this is only a sketch, so we'll blend it later, but we'll have the idea of how to place the volume, the highlights. So try focusing on this part. Here will be the most lit part. It will catch more light. And the second. Okay, so it's a raw plan, but also we can add the final highlights just to show. So you can see that it's beginning to be visible. You have more contrast. Also, then at the finish we'll add more colors to the mid-tone, so it will look even more warm, and we can add small details that will generate more reflection. But try to focus on this part, and here. And the almost white color. Okay, so this is the sketch. So you can see the placement of light, how it will look. Okay. Of course, then we can add small reflections on the bottom of this eagle to fill the dark places. Also here and to be similar as those on the belt. So now let's start blending this surface.
A few moments later.
Okay, so after making the sketch, now we can blend, we can smooth the transitions. So at first I will work on the shadows. So we want to clear all the recesses, we want to clear all the lines that are combining elements. So even if you, when making the sketch, you covered it with lighter colors, you can always go back and fix this. Also on the eagle. It's also good to work on smaller details because you work on precise painting. For me, the one miniature that was game-changing was Forge World horse model, because he has a lot of small details on his armor. So after painting this small and all those small details, I felt the difference. I could paint smaller things, so it's nice to practice this, not just making a wash to cover the to add shadows, but just painting with brush all the shadows, all the recesses, because you will be able then to paint small details freely. So just outline. So we want to outline the skull. And this dark color will give us the contrast we need to make the non-metallic metal shine. Because if you don't use deep, very dark shadows, even if you paint almost white, there won't be that much visible contrast. So you won't achieve the semblance of metal, the feeling of it shining. Okay, so now let's work on the shadows. So let's start working on the belt. So you can see here the transition will be from dark to bright on the bottom. We also don't want the bottom part shined so strong like the upper part. So as earlier, we are adding more highlights because we have the deep shadows. So you can see we are working on the shadows. I try to focus mostly on the darker parts to make them a little brighter in some areas. You can see that I've covered parts of the sketch because covering them gave me a little more saturated color. And now let's go further. Now let's make stronger highlights. So here, as I mentioned it, only on the bottom. Also here. Later on we'll add a little battle damage to the belt and also maybe to the eagle. It's very good to paint the battle damage on the run, so you don't want to finish the element and then add battle damage, because most of the time for me it looks unnatural. It looks like a smooth surface with added scratches. You want it to be gradual. So at some point the scratches will be visible, so we can start making them, adding them with small lines, with dots, and it will give a more realistic feeling. And also here, as I mentioned earlier, here there will be more lights, so I add highlights in this place. Also on the skull. So at this point, even if we cover the earlier sketch, you can see the difference, yeah, because it's thin paint on very bright color and in some places on very dark color. We can also start highlighting here, because it's here on the bottom of each of those feathers will be visible a highlight from the surrounding. Also in this place and on the bottom of the skull. So each small feather you can glaze a little. Okay, so let's add further highlights. So you can see that it's beginning to be visible because we are using brighter colors. So more light on the skull. You can see that every skull has some characteristic points, like here and here on the forehead. You always want to place highlight there, where the nose is, where the eyes are, and on the forehead. And also, let's focus on this part even more. So you can see that the orangey color, it's more visible now because we covered it, the surface where the sketch was. But at this point probably we're just working on the started working on the mid-tone of the non-metallic metal. But it's also important that this color is very visible on the non-metallic metal because it adds warmth, adds the non-metallic metal feeling, and it's the main color of the surface. Okay, so as you can see it's darker now. Now we need to build all the contrast we need to represent light reflecting from a surface. So now we can start adding more highlights, and at this point, if you want to add texture, you can add small streaks, small dots here and there, even in the darkest spots. So also you should remember when painting textures, they should be realistic, they should look like the element is really worn. Don't place scratches where nobody would scratch that surface. It's not logical, because if this marine uses the belt, this armor very long, then it will have signs of scratches in certain places, like on the outline of this element, because it's more prone to being scratched. Also on maybe the bottom, something like this, maybe he's pressing it. So think in a way how this element would be damaged, but do it in a logical way, not to overdo the effect. also the light frame from the bottom. So you can see that the non-metallic metal is taking shape. The more scratches you add at this point, the more the final scratches will blend to the whole picture. So let's highlight this place even more. Here also you can add small dots. As I showed you in earlier materials, you can paint only with dots. Just tap the surface with the brush, but it will add texture. Also the highlights from the bottom. So now let's start adding more highlights. Okay. Probably here this is maybe the next highlight will be the final one on this bottom part, because we don't want the bottom part to be that bright. Maybe one or two more, but that's it. And we want to focus on the upper part, just to generate the difference, as I mentioned it earlier. Okay. Also small reflection on the side of the skull and here. Also this side should be a little darker, so because it's not our main light source, so we'll stop at some point on this side, just not overdo it. Now that little more highlight, so you can see it's beginning to show. You can see that we are working on the upper part of the belt, now the lower part. We want to add, you can see even now we can add small dots, scratches, just to add further detail. And a little highlight on the skull. and more highlights here in the place where we want the more light to be visible. Okay, so let's add further highlights. Want to strengthen it all to the almost white, because we want the semblance of shine. Also, each time we cover a smaller surface, just to leave the base color and generate contrast. Also, you can lower the amount of highlights we are using. Maybe some places aren't that strongly lit. Some places are, so we can operate with it. You can of course do it faster, but if you want a smooth transition, you need to make small changes to the mixtures. So that's why I'm using 12 tones, not 9. So you can see now I'm focusing on the upper light source, the main light source, and don't paint the bottom light, because we want the light focus to be from above. So it's taking shape. Just a little here on the end. We don't want to overdo this side. So those highlights, those final highlights, will generate a big difference. So we'll see the effect even more. So now let's add the final highlights. They should occupy a small space only. Just small reflections. It will focus the attention. But this generates a big contrast between the darkest shades and the brightest colors. So only the upper part of the belt. So as you can see that we are adding more highlights to make the difference more dramatic. So some highlights only just on the tip of each wing, each feather. Here a small dick. And here. And now the final one.